Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and welcome to the host that is listening online and watching online. I'm Richard Layard. I'm an economist from the Centre for Economic Performance, which is hosting this event. I've been lucky enough to know Olivier for 40 years, the first 10 of which we worked quite closely together. I learnt a lot, and it was a lot of fun. So it's lovely to have Olivier here. As you know, he is one of the greatest economists we have, and certainly one of the most influential. He spent most of his life at the MIT, but he was also Chief Economist at the IMF. He's now at the Peterson Institute, where he works on all the great challenges facing the world economy, which include the three we're going to talk about tonight, which are inflation, public debt, and trade wars. So Olivier is going to talk for about, or we'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions from you. If you're online, please submit your question on the Q&A function, and someone here will read it out. If you've got a mobile, please turn it silent. If fire breaks out, we'll all go up to the street above. and now let's think about inflation. We've been through a period in the last 3 years of higher inflation than we had experienced for quite a number of decades before that. And that is a huge challenge to many people, what they call the cost of living challenge, because their wages, certainly during parts of this period, didn't keep up with the prices. So, Olivier, we'd like to know what you think about the future of inflation and of living standards.
Good. I'll start with the past,
Okay.
which is easier for various reasons. And I'm going to derail the intro because I want to say a few things about you. So I came here today, left my French island, and I wouldn't do this for anybody except Richard, because he's celebrating. He has been very modest, but he's celebrating his 90th birthday, and he's still the Richard that I have known for the best of the last 40. Is it 40 years? I thought it was more 50, but
40.
We don't want to get too old. And let me say a bit more how we actually converged both professionally and then personally. We had a common friend who was a professor at MIT by the name of Rudi Dornbusch, that some of you may know, who was doing international macro. And he had been asked by the European Commission to create a small group of advisors. And wisely or unwisely, he asked Richard and me and a few others at the time to actually join him. It was an interesting experience because at the time the European Commission was not exactly open to new ideas, and Rudi was in the business of having new ideas, new and provocative. But for Richard and I, what happened is that, is it fair to say that, Richard, you learned macro, at least some, and I learned labor, at least some as well. And this was a time in which it was just incredibly useful to put the two together. And I think it led, at least in my case, and I suspect in yours, to a period of extreme creativity in terms of progress in research. On your side, it led to the work that was summarized in the book that you wrote with Steve Nichol and Richard Jackman, which I think is a great book. It's a messy book. very messy book, but it is very messy for a good reason. The labor market is very messy, and the book gets really to the granularity of it, and I think that's a great book, honestly, still today. At my end, I was a bit more theoretical, is a bit ambitious a word, but abstract, and I developed the theory of imperfect competition in goods markets, monopolistic competition, and bargaining in the labor market, and created some kind of simple aggregate macro model based on that, and it played decently well as well. But that was very much the result of long discussions, typically in Brussels.
Walking the streets.
Walking in the streets until wee hours. We could have been arrested. And it was just a marvelous part of my life, for a decade, is my guess. Complemented with invitations from Richard to actually stay in his house, where I stayed twice. Once with Stan Fisher, in which we wrote the book that some of you may have suffered through, lectures on macroeconomics. And the other time with Larry Summers, in which we introduced the notion of hysteresis in labor markets. And in addition, given that neither of us was extremely good at using a washing machine, we actually put all our dirty clothes in one washing machine, and for the rest of the stay had a nice set of gray things, no matter what their original color might have been. But we made some progress on the hysteresis form. So after this, as you well know, Richard decided to take big themes, happiness, mental health, well-being, wellness, which are clearly the most important themes that you can think of. And I didn't have quite these intellectual guts, and I went back to plumbing, macro, which is fiscal policy, monetary policy, exchange rate policy, macroprudential, and I developed some of these skills when I went to the fund. So very different endpoints, but a lot of fun along the way, and I really wanted to be here. Now, did you ask a question about inflation?
Yeah, and living standards.
And living standards. So let me just give a view of how I view inflation, which I suspect is the question behind your question. Mm-hmm. So just to indicate, this is something on which I've done recent research. I did a paper with Ben Bernanke on the United States, trying to organize my thoughts, our thoughts. And then last year, I was approached by 10 central banks, including the Bank of England, to basically do the same exercise. And so I have a good sense, I think, of what has happened in these countries over the last, say, three and a half years. And here you hear a lot of, there has been a lot of controversies, there has been a lot of statements which I think are wrong, and you hear that initially there was this team transitory versus team permanent discussion, some of you may remember, with very different implications for the future. There is now the discussion about what's known as the last mile, which is how to go from where we are, which is 3-4% to 2%. There are even stronger statements about the need to completely rethink at least the labor market, maybe all of macro, maybe all of economics. And my sense is, nah. I mean, what has happened, I think, can be explained fairly easily. It has characteristics which are proper, specific to the environment in which we have been, but there's no great puzzle, so there's no need to completely rewrite textbooks, which is a good thing, given that I don't like to rewrite my textbook every couple of years. I don't think I have to change that chapter very much. Okay, all this to say, when we basically wrote down a very simple econometric first analytical, then econometric model, to put in place all the explanations which had been given for the movement in inflation. So price of food, price of energy, supply chains, greedflation, role of US fiscal policy, Ukraine, and to just organize this discussion in terms of a wage equation, a price equation, expectation equations, putting the right things on the right-hand side. And we analyzed it, and then we estimated, and I would say that sometimes it doesn't work, but this time it worked, in the sense that it gives a story based on econometrics, which makes, to me, a lot of sense. So what happened on the way up, it's basically relative prices. The price of oil just jumped, the price of food just jumped for various reasons. Then Ukraine came, and that gave further impulses to the price of energy. COVID created supply chain disruptions in which you couldn't get the good that you needed to produce the next one, so you had to increase the price of the final one to decrease demand. You didn't have much to sell. And that explains nearly all of the increase in inflation from the late 2019 to the peak is typically mid-2022. And then, basically, the shocks turned around. The price of energy went down. The supply constraints became less binding. We found ways of getting things from A to B. And inflation went down. And that's nearly all the story, except it's not all the story. What happened during that time is what I thought would play a stronger role, didn't play such a strong role, but was there, is what happened in the labor market. So as the movements from quarter to quarter just moved a lot because the price of energy would move, because the price of food, behind the scene, or if you want, in the hidden part of the iceberg, you had increasing labor market tightness. Now, nearly all the countries we looked at had a tighter labor market when we stopped the econometrics, which is at the end of 2023, than pre-COVID. So tight labor markets, and then higher inflation, leading to some increase in expected inflation, which then were reflected in wages. Not a strong effect, both the labor market effect relatively small, but every quarter, and expectation just a bit higher. And so when the price shocks disappeared, which is roughly around, middle of 2022, what remained was the rest of the iceberg, which was too much pressure on wages coming from this steady push from the labor market and the steady increase, small increase in expectations. And that's where we are in most countries. So it went up, it went down, but didn't go all the way, because during that time, there had been increasing wage pressure. And so where we are today is very much at the point at which we have an underlying wage inflation, which is a bit too high if the central banks want to go back to 2%. To be very concrete, in the US or in the UK, you have wage growth between 3.5 and 4. It depends which measure you use. You want to go to 2% inflation. If productivity growth is 1%, you're just not going to do it. So you need to decrease it. So this is what is known as the last mile. And this means monetary policy probably has to do something to slow down the machine. Let me make, these are long answers. Okay. Let me make another point, which is a question that I'm asked. Well, this movement in inflation, it had nothing to do with monetary policy. It had to do with relative price shocks. I don't think that's true. I mean, clearly the price shocks came partly from Ukraine, partly from demand. But if there hadn't been credibility of central banks and expectations had moved like they did in the 1970s, then the shocks that we kept having, which went away very quickly in terms of their effects, would have built up. And we would have had a very different outcome, basically the kind of outcome that Paul Volcker faced in the late 70s, early 80s. But monetary policy did a lot by having been credible, having built credibility for 20 years before. And that really changed the dynamics and made the inflation go up, but then go down quickly. Now what we have is something different, which is that in the US, in the UK, we have a labor market which is still a bit tight, and we have wage growth which is 1.5% too high. And the question is what happens? So that's the question that the governors now have to deal with, or the chairman of the Fed. And here I think the baseline has, and that's what we found in the simulations from the central bank project, the central banks have to slow down the machine a bit. They have to basically get wage growth down to a level which would be consistent with 2% growth. So I think the baseline is in a number of countries, UK, US, we have to have some decrease in unemployment. That's the baseline. That's where there's a lot of discussions. We can be more optimistic than the baseline, and we always have to think in terms of a distribution. So the baseline is kind of the mean of the mode. There are hopes. I'll talk about the US. I know less about the UK, but I think it's similar. Suppose that productivity growth increases from its historical recent trend to a higher level. So it goes to 1.5% a year. Well, in this case, wage growth might be consistent with 2% inflation, right? You can allow more wage growth because it's basically undone by productivity growth. And there is some evidence that this is indeed happening. It could also be that the labor market is in fact not as tight as we think. And there's a whole discussion, this is getting a bit nerdy, about the shifts in the beverage curve, which I'm not going to go into, but if they continue, maybe we can just do a soft landing without having to tighten unemployment too much.
But let me ask you, I mean, in the meantime, over the last 3 years, people have suffered, in Britain certainly, quite a big, severe shock to their living standards.
Okay.
So when you talk about the percentage change in the future, are they going to recapture what they lost?
Okay, so there are two aspects to it. In the model that we have with Ben, we think of this as catch-up, which is people, when prices go up in advance of wages, do workers say, aha, I want this back, which is what we call the catch-up effect. And we found very, very little of it, which means that people seem to say, well, that's the way it is. Now, it could be that maybe with long lags it will appear, but in the data we didn't find it. That's the first point, which surprises me, but is really very, very, very much there in the data. The other is the notion that real wages or real income has decreased. Is actually not right in general. Real wages in many countries are a bit lower because prices have moved up. That's inevitable once the price of non-labor inputs goes up, something has to give. And so real wages have not...
You're talking the terms of trade, are you talking about that?
No, I'm talking that if you pay more the guy who gives you oil, then you have to pay the worker less. Right? It's just, but this effect is small and has been largely compensated by increases in the rest of revenues, transfers and so on. So there are many countries where real wages are actually more or less where they were in 2019. Now, that's less good. You realize
not here.
This is not as good as going up from 2019, but it means at least it's not worse. And we didn't see pressure. I would have thought that in tight labor markets, you would see workers being in a strong bargaining position, say, not only do we want to be protected for the future inflation, which is the standard mechanism, but we also want to get back some of what we lost. And we did not find it econometrically in any country except one, Belgium, which has indexation, which is the only country in the sample we have in which there is still indexation. In the 1970s, most countries had indexation, nearly 100% indexation. So when there was an increase in the price level, the wage would increase, which would lead to more increases in prices and so on. That's largely gone. But in Belgium, they have a complex system of indexation, and there you see a bit more catch-up. But it hasn't been a major issue.
Let's move on to debt.
You sure? Because I didn't answer your question.
What more did you want to say?
I wanted to answer your question. But this was background. No. Standard of living.
Yes.
Right? So, again, when there is a period of inflation, when the shocks come from non-labor inputs, then there is going to be mechanically some decrease in the standard of living, or things equal, because you're giving more to some and therefore there is less for the others. So there's some of that we discussed. I think there is a more general issue, which is, again, more closer to the things you work on, which is why are people so unhappy about inflation? And much more so than in any survey we did in the past. And I think the reason, which has been given by many, is that they think in terms not of inflation, but level of prices. And they see a very large increase in the level of prices of the order of 20% on average. And they do not feel, and sometimes it's true, that their wages have increased by as much. In many countries they have, but the perception is still that this is really bad. And so I think this explains why there's a lot of unhappiness to take, the US. Inflation is not very high at this point, it's 2.5. But people are extremely unhappy, and I think it comes from the notion that a 20% price increase is something that they have a very hard time to swallow.
Can we move on to debt?
If you want to.
So, I'm actually on a House of Lords committee on the sustainability of British public debt, which Olivier gave a very, very good presentation to the other day. But, this is obviously something that has changed enormously over the last 20 years. Partly due, first, of course, to the financial crash and the bailouts, then due to COVID and spending on furlough, etc., then due to the energy price rise and supporting people with their energy costs. So you've now got in the main advanced countries debt up to something similar to the annual GNP, from something half of that or less 20 years ago. How dangerous is this? So there are some people who are saying, no, we absolutely have to have it coming down from where it is now. Or there are some who say, well, let's contain it where it is. Some even say we can allow it to continue to go up again because people say, you're borrowing against some capital investment. So if you think of the needs of the budget is needing not only to repair in Britain very, very rocky existing social services, but it's got to take account in the future of the green transition. It's got to take into account the aging of the population. So you've got huge pressures on the budget. Some people say, well, we should cover some of this green investment by borrowing and letting the debt go up. So please give us some wisdom as how to think about the future of the debt.
Good. So let me actually give you the punchlines on the three issues. On inflation, I'm not terribly worried. We're not worried. We need to go. There's some way to go, but it's not catastrophic. On debt, I'm not incredibly worried. It's a bit harder. It's a bit more of a challenge, and I'll explain why. The one where I feel most worried is the third. We'll come to it, the commercial wars, trade wars, and so on. So on that, I mean, you hear incredibly scary statements, right? And, debt is, as Richard said, 100% of GDP. How can we pay back 100% of GDP, which would take all of GDP? Can't do it. The other argument is, well, with that level of debt, we're leaving our kids with just an incredibly high level of taxes, which they won't be able to pay, and God knows what will happen. I think all these are misunderstandings of what debt is and what debt does. Let me start with a provocative statement. I'm not used to that. But I think it will make the point. So suppose I'm going to argue that the debt level, or more precisely the ratio of debt to PIB, which is typically the number, the 100% that we were talking about, is of not much importance. And then I shall argue that what matters is the so-called primary deficit, which is the part, it's spending not including interest payments minus revenues. And that's what we call the primary deficit. And that's the issue. The debt issue is not per se a major one, but the primary deficit is something we have to handle. So start with an economy in which there is no primary deficit, but there is debt. And that is going to grow at rate. So suppose that when interest payments on debt come due, you issue new debt. Debt is going to increase at the rate of interest, right? That's exactly what you do. We're looking at the debt ratio, which is the debt relative to GDP. GDP is increasing at the growth rate. Now, so you can see that these two things, the interest rate and the growth rate, matter. We are in an environment, and I think likely to be, although Richard may want to come back to this, in which R, the interest rate, and G, the growth rate, are roughly equal and are likely to be more or less equal over the future. In that configuration, then basically you can just roll over the debt and the debt ratio will not increase, no matter what the level of debt is. And you can see why, because the numerator will increase at rate R, the denominator will increase at rate G. If the two are the same, the ratio will remain the same. So this very simple arithmetic exercise says it may not be a big deal. And again, this is due to the fact that we are in an environment in which R minus G, to use the expression that we use as economists, is roughly zero. And we can come back. I don't think it's going to be positive. I could even become negative again. Okay, so the first conclusion is don't obsess about that. You can have that, and in this case, in the case I've given, you never have to raise taxes to pay for the debt. Just keep issuing debt. So the notion that it's incredibly costly for the future just goes away. Now, it was provocative because it was too strong, and I have to go back and kind of introduce some things, which is that if you have a level of debt of 20% to GDP, and the interest rate moves, and it moves, or R minus G moves, well, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference. If the interest rate increases by 1%, then basically, it's 1% times 20%, it's 0.2%. Doesn't much matter in terms of the budget. But if you have a country like Japan, which has debt to GDP of, if you take net debt, 170%, right? And then the interest rate increases by 1%. Then your budget suddenly has to find 1.7% more in terms of GDP, and that's a fiscal crisis. So the level of debt matters because of the uncertainty it creates. But this being said, if you look around the world, there was a time where it was thought that 60% was the limit, then 90%, and then if we look around the world, again, you have Japan, which doesn't have any problem financing its debt at 170% net, 250% gross. So that's really not the issue. It would be better if it was lower, but it's not the issue. The issue is a primary deficit. If R minus G is equal to 0, which is the case I gave, then the debt ratio is going to evolve, it's going to increase as long as there is a primary deficit. And in many countries, mine in particular, but the US, for example, also, the primary deficit is fairly large. So basically, in France, the primary deficit is around 4%. To stabilize the debt, not to decrease it, we have to go from 4% of GDP to 0%. In a country like France, where the revenues as a ratio to GDP are already incredibly high, 55%, in which the politics, as you may have noticed, is not exactly easy. Finding 4% of GDP is tough. So the best hope is that we can do it over time by the proper reforms without having revolution in the street. That's tough, but it's doable. It has been done in the past by other countries. So that's the technical problem. It's a technical, political problem. I have not much doubt that in Europe, the new fiscal rules which have been put in place by Brussels, which basically force such an adjustment, are going to be not respected, but not cheated very much. The reason they're not going to be cheated very much is that they are new. So you wait a bit until the rules are old before you start cheating, which is what they did with the old rules. But the general impression I have is in Europe, we're going to have a period of fiscal consolidation, which is not very good for growth, but we may be able to achieve our goal. Once we're at 0, primary deficit is gone, then we can start thinking about decreasing debt, but this will take a while. I compare this to the US. The US has roughly the same primary deficit. It has roughly the same ratio of debt to GDP, but it shows absolutely no interest in doing anything about it. And basically, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have any plans to do anything about the deficit. And there, one starts worrying, because if this is the case, then the debt ratio keeps increasing, and at some stage, it becomes too large, right? Investors start saying, they're just going to go on, and at some stage, they are going to do something crazy. When is this going to happen in the US? The US is a very special place in terms of government liabilities. The US treasuries are used by everybody in the world and are seen as liquid and safe. So it will take a while, but I don't think that's an issue for the next 2-3 years. But especially if Trump is elected and does more of that, then we might see a fiscal crisis in the US. But that's fairly far out. If there was a fiscal crisis, the US is not like France. The ratio of revenues to GDP is much lower. So it's a political issue. It's not a technical issue. We can increase the income tax rate in the US and solve the problem very easily. The question is nobody wants to do it.
But what about, if you take Britain now, we have these tremendous problems affecting the public services. We've got penciled in cuts in public services outside the protected areas in the final period of the next Parliament. But do you really think that we can contain the primary deficit without raising taxes? What's your impression? I know you're not. You'll say you're not an expert on Britain, but I think people here. We've got an election campaign going at the moment, and
One more reason for me not to give an answer.
You don't hear the radio every 4 hours or so like we do. So the Institute of Fiscal Studies is saying, believe it or not, that there are only three alternatives: one, to raise taxes; two, to cut spending; and three, to borrow. Do you have any wisdom to offer in this debate?
No, I have no wisdom to offer. But I can talk about a country I know something about. France has the same issues. It has a 4% deficit. It needs to build defense. It needs to do green investment. We have a health system which is not quite as bad as yours, but needs repairs. We have an education system which is worse than yours and needs repairs. And when you add all this, that tends to increase the deficit rather than decrease it. I think on this we should be very pragmatic. We should not be lexicographic about debt and then. So I think these things justify some increase in debt. I mean, some of it can be financed by debt, partly for good economic reasons, because what we do with the debt is precious and very important, and partly for political reasons, which is these are things that we need to do if we want to show the voters that we're doing the right thing. So I hate this idea that, first we need to decrease debt, then we'll see what we do. That's not the way. You think about what you need to do, you try to cut where you can, you decrease the deficit, or you even increase it for a while, and then decrease it slowly. It may take 10 years. At the end, debt, instead of being 100%, maybe 120, not the end of the world if you've saved the trees and solved global warming. I'm exaggerating, but you can see that I had in my textbook, this is marketing now, a cartoon which I couldn't keep, but the year is 2050, and there's an old man, and he is surrounded by the countryside where all trees are dead, grass is brown, it's terrible. And there's a young man, and the old man says to the young man, yes, we've destroyed the earth, but that is 59% of GDP. I think it captures exactly what the trade-off shouldn't be.
No, but are you saying, in answer to the Institute of Fiscal Studies trilemma, why not do a bit of borrowing? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. We have to be careful. I mean, first, suppose that that it's absolutely existential to do this, to do that, and there's no way in which you can raise taxes sufficiently without a revolution, then finance it by debt, right? I mean, it seems to me that now, again, you want to go as far as you can in limiting what you need to do, but doing what you need, seeing whether there's really no room for any tax increase or for limited tax increase, and then do the borrowing. But again, I think that if you do all the right thing and it leads to a level of the debt ratio of 130, say, or whatever, do it.
So I think we should come on to what really worries you.
Okay.
Which is the trade wars. I think most of us know a little bit about what's been going on between America and China, but this is a more general issue. Yeah. How serious do you think that is? And what's your advice? How can we handle this?
I'll be limited in my advice because these are hard issues to solve. But I've been struck by all the forces which are pushing towards deglobalization. And I made a list, and the list is useful because it shows that it's coming from all sides. there's this expression, perfect storm, and I think that's the right one. So let me list them if I remember. So the first one is trade is good, but it has distribution effects, right? And the standard line in the Washington consensus was, well, because it's good overall, we can then do redistribution and protect the losers, and everybody is better off. It's a joke, because we never protect the losers sufficiently, and even if we gave them, people lose their jobs, even if you give them some financial compensation, they have lost a job. And, talking to you, we know what the value of a job is in terms of happiness. So this has always been a tension, and I think it's worse because it's kind of more visible. It's known as the China shock in the US, which has destroyed parts of, small towns in the US by making them bankrupt. I think social media plays a role in. So the worry about distributional effects of trade is such that I think it leads to consider tariff protection. That's one. The second one is economics. So on this, by the way, on all these things, you can say, well, there's something there. Maybe we want to protect a town. Maybe we want to protect inefficient farmers. Maybe there's a trade-off, distribution versus efficiency. But it's clear that the danger that it goes too far is very high. The economic security, which is floods in Thailand and you don't get your stuff, it's Fukushima, it's the Strait of Hormuz, that is increasingly relevant, I think, because the supply chains are becoming more and more extended. And that creates problems. We saw this during COVID. And so I think there is a very good argument for actually trying to do friendshoring, to have things closer to home, to limit the risk of catastrophes. Again, it can be taken too far. And this is something which I think should be left to firms. They know what's best. Then you have national security, and that's, again, relevant. And there's a good argument for thinking that you don't want to depend on some Chinese rare minerals in case there are tensions. So, again, I think it's a perfectly good argument, but it means that you probably want to be dealing with friends on the crucial inputs rather than with other countries. It's being taken too far, again, which is, the example of US Steel, where a Japanese firm wanted to buy, and the US used the argument of national security, which makes no sense in the context of steel. It was not an issue. Then you have industrial policy. Now, industrial policy is not seen as a commercial war, but it is, right? And basically, when you subsidize your industries, you protect them. And again, there are good arguments for industrial policy. Probably we had underplayed them, and there's a lot of industries where there's increasing returns. You want to protect an infant industry. But again, it's totally misused politically by protecting industries which should not be protected, but that again has the same effect. Then you have something which has come out of a fight against global warming. This is between the US and Europe, which is conceptually you have two main tools to try to get from brown to green energy. You can do the right thing, which is a carbon tax, which taxes the brown energy, forces it to decrease, or you can give subsidies to the green energy so that they produce more, which is not quite as good, but works as well. One is incredibly politically difficult, the first. The second is when you give money to people, typically they don't dislike it. So the US, in its wisdom, has chosen the subsidies route. Europe is a bit tougher and has chosen to have carbon fees and carbon taxes. But this means that there is a the competitiveness gap between the firms in the US, which receive subsidies, and the firms in Europe, which pay taxes or pay carbon fees. And that's leading to tensions, and these tensions are not going to go away. Mm-hmm. So I think that's my list, but the conclusion is we're going to see a lot more trade than we used to see, is my...
Trade wars.
Well, so trade wars, industrial policy, bans on. I mean, just sort of a question. So this was the intro, I think, of factors. And again, each of them is different, so you want to think about how I deal with each one. But what are the macro implications of that? And there are two views, two extreme views. One is kind of a Keynesian view, which is, okay, so we're going to export less because markets will be cut, and we're going to import less. And what matters from the IS equation is the sum of exports and imports, cancels, no big deal, no big deal. The other extreme is, no, we are going to need some rare metal from a country. We're not going to do it. We're not going to be able to produce one car, and our economy is just going to collapse, right? Which is looking at the supply side. And it's clear that the truth is somewhere in the middle. And the question is, where in the middle? And here, I think we're starting to do, not me, but I'm starting to read interesting work in the context, in particular, of what happened to Germany when they stopped the gas supply. And there were these two views. One was, it's catastrophic. We need gas. If we don't have gas, people are going to starve. Nights are going to be cold. And then there was another view by young economist who said, no, because if you don't get your stuff here, you can get it there. So the elasticity of substitution in production between what you don't have anymore and what you can use, the elasticity of substitution in terms of suppliers. If you can't get them from there, maybe you can get it from there. The elasticity of substitution in terms of exports. If I don't export to China, can I export to the rest of the world? And the reason I say this is that these guys and girls, it's a team, this concluded at the very start of the Ukraine war that it would not be a big deal, that the German industry would be able to reallocate and find, and they have been right. Mm-hmm. So we may survive, but it's going to make life substantially more complicated. It has implications for monetary policy. I think we're going to see a lot of so-called supply shocks, increases in tariffs, shortage of this, shortage of that, and possibly for fiscal, but I'll stop there.
Right. Now, I think it's time to have some questions. Thank you for all of that, Olivier. Who's got the mic? Oh, well done.
Yes. Thank you very much for the talk. It's an honor.
Lord, take three?
Can you hear me?
No, when we take three, it allows me not to answer one.
Yeah, wouldn't you like
I like
that?
to answer questions.
Well, you like to answer them one by one. Okay, quick. But not more than 2 sentences.
Yes.
One of them with a question mark.
Perfect. Could you explain why you're optimistic about long-term interest rates? Because your colleague Larry Summers seems to be more pessimistic. Thank you very much.
That's an easy question. Larry likes to disagree with me.
Obviously.
Now, the serious answer is that for 35 years before COVID, the real safe interest rate steadily declined, became extremely low in 2019. There was a large negative number. It's hard for me to think that the factors which were behind this are entirely gone. I can think of factors which might be gone. So, for example, QE. QE probably did something to the long real rates. And QT, which is undoing it, is going to lead to an increase. So I think I would give 100 basis points more than in 2019. The other argument which Larry pushes and I don't is the increase in public debt. If there's more public debt, people will require a higher rate. The evidence for the moment is that it's not terribly important. And a point which I should have made earlier is that the increase in debt from the last 3 years is relatively small. We've had extremely large deficits, but we've had a lot of inflation and much lower nominal rates. So actually, if you look at the sum of the deficits for various countries over the last 4 years, you'll get easily a number of the order of 20%. That ratio didn't go up by 20%. It went up on average by 10. The reason is that when you have nominal debt and inflation, it eats at the debt. So these are the two factors. The factors I think are staying is the whole aging issue, which means that we're saving more, and thus the demand for assets is bigger. And I think the demand for liquidity, which means that for a given average marginal product, people are willing to hold something which they see as safe at a lower rate. And that comes partly from an institutional demand by financial institutions, which have to hold more liquid and more safe assets. And in general, the world is not exactly less risky than it was in 2019. So the notion that you can buy an asset which is safe seems to me to be as worth now as it was then. So my conclusion is we're not going to see the negative R stars that we were seeing before, but I still think that in many countries R star will be below or close to G, close to the growth rate.
Next. My sight's not too good. Sushil.
Well, thank you very much for a splendid talk again. Richard said only 2 sentences. So sentence 1, how worried are you about inflation in the US if Mr. Trump comes to power, for all the obvious reasons, restrictions on migration, making the Fed less independent, renewing the tax cuts, tariffs? Sentence 1. Sentence 2.
2 questions.
Could you possibly shed some light on why expectations have been less well-behaved in the UK versus the US through this episode? We certainly saw it in terms of wage expectations, which remained much stickier here than they did in the US, and we're still seeing it in the markets. In our inflation-linked market, expectations 20 years out are still 100 basis points above target, while in the US you're close to target. Thank you.
Okay. When people ask 2 questions, I forget the first one. Remember what it was?
Mr. Trump. Mr.
What?
Trump and inflation.
Oh, inflation. Am I worried about inflation in the US? Right.
Because of Mr. Trump.
Do I have a question?
Sorry.
I understood the first question is, am I worried about inflation in the US?
Because of Mr. Trump.
Oh, because of Mr. Trump. Okay, but even aside from Mr. Trump, we're not where we need to be. And, this kind of plateau, which I talked about, is too high, right? So this is a worry. Yes, I worry about Mr. Trump, not the only one, and not only for that reason. For 2 reasons. The first one is that he's going to increase tariffs, and despite what he says, tariffs are actually inflationary, and they're going to complicate the job of the Fed. And almost surely he's going to do nothing to the deficit. Indeed, he's probably going to do more to the deficit. To the extent that you believe that large deficits lead people to anticipate inflation. So the fiscal theory of a price level, which I don't quite buy, but some do, then seeing very large deficits may lead to the anticipation of inflation. I think that works only if he replaces Jay Powell or by somebody who is quite willing to take orders. Now we get to the politics. Last time, the names that he suggested were people who would have done anything to be kissed by him. This time, the names of the people that are branded around are of conservatives of the usual kind. And I would think that at least one or two of them have backbone. Without the Fed, I don't think that he can really just get inflation going through that channel. But yeah, reason to worry. Question 2, now I've forgotten question 2.
Let's move on. Who was the person you wanted to head of the question?
No, Sushil had a second question.
Oh, okay.
If I repeat it, I'm sorry.
Just quickly.
It's the difference in the behavior of inflation expectations in the UK versus the US.
Okay,
If you could shed some light.
so this is a good question because I cannot answer it. Yeah, because I've done some work on the stability of inflation. I did this yesterday night. I basically took 4 countries, but I didn't put the UK. I did 3 countries. No, I actually did 4 countries. I did the UK. It was BOE. So I have in the model with Ben Bernanke, I have 2 equations. One for short-run expectations as a function of past inflation, and one with long-run expectations as a function of. And what I found, and I think the UK is the exception, is that for the effect of inflation, and then I estimated the coefficient of a set of coefficients on inflation by increasing the sample starting in 2019, adding 1 quarter, and tracing the results for the coefficients. What was common, I think, to all 4, Euro, BOE, not Japan, so all 3, US, was that this was very stable. The coefficient did not increase on long run. So strong stability of long run expectations. It was a bit different for the 1 year ahead expectation, in which clearly there was some response, but the response kind of did like this. It was higher when inflation was very high, it was coming down. In general, when you put this in a dynamic model, that basically leads to some effect on wages, which doesn't last very long because people, when they see inflation coming down, revise down. I did not see a dramatic difference between the UK and the other countries, but I'll go back and I'll email you if I'm wrong.
Who next?
Take a woman.
Right at the back. No, further.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Leonie. I'm a current master's student at LSE. Going off of the future changes to trade,
You have to speak loud.
Oh, sorry. Going off of the future changes to trade, which you foresee, could you speak to the effect on multinational corporations and international investment practices?
So I'm not sure I got the...
I couldn't hear.
If a question... Sorry, I'm going to do my best.
Yeah.
This is a question about the taxation of multinationals?
Just in general with the commercial wars and the potential deglobalization and those trade practices, how do you think that will affect multinational corporations?
Okay, I understand the question. It's a very good one because I've talked about deglobalization, but it's not coming. It's not there yet. I mean, you see some changes, but nothing of the magnitude which I think should take place. And I think this reflects the fact that these supply chains these multinationals having operations in many countries, find it incredibly efficient to do so. And so for the moment, I think they are not willing to completely change operations and repatriate or go to countries which are safe. I think that's interesting because there's clearly a tension between the tariffs on the one and the commercial wars and their stance, which is we're going to continue, which indicates that if they are forced to do it, which could happen if commercial wars become more intense, we may just prohibit imports from country X or exports to country X. They are going to suffer. We really want to continue to do business the way they do. One way of interpreting this is that the productivity loss from reshoring or friendshoring of decreasing supply chains may be very, very substantial. That's how I interpret their behavior, because they're under tremendous pressure to regroup. And they're not really doing it. There's some evidence that they're regrouping by big group, a China group, a US group, but it is not happening on the scale that I'm afraid may come.
I'm going to ask Joe, have we time for a question online?
I can see one in quickly. You spoke about inflation with regards to the US and Europe, and we have Al Mukit here from Dhaka in Bangladesh asking, how can central banks in developing countries improve their monetary policy frameworks to better manage inflation?
So one of my projects is indeed to do the same exercise as I did for the 10 advanced economy central banks for emerging markets, and see how different it is in terms of the behavior of expectations and so on. My impression is that in general, they have done decently well. And I'll leave it at that, but if you re-invite me in a year, I will give you the full answer.
Olivier, we have to stop. We could go on forever.
Yep.
You referred to yourself as a plumber, which is completely incorrect. And now, we had the common friend who we loved, Rudy. And Rudy always talked about two kinds of people. You remember this. There were two kinds of economists, actually. There were the goldsmiths and the silversmiths. And you...
Which one?
I'm not sure about me, but you were definitely a goldsmith, and tonight has definitely been pure gold. Thank you very much. You remember that phrase, I think?
Yeah, but you didn't have a prize.